There is a reality few are prepared to face, because it dismantles comforting assumptions about justice and protection. God does not always confront evil directly. Sometimes he simply removes the restraint. And when that restraint is gone, what follows is not chaos, it is consequence. If you have ever been removed from a relationship without closure, explanation, or vindication, understand this carefully. Your removal was not abandonment, it was authorization. Authorization for truth to speak where your presence once muted it. And that is where this message begins. God did not remove you because you failed, but because you stayed too long. Many people spend years replaying a single question in their minds. What did I do wrong? That question, however sincere, often misses the deeper issue. Not every ending is the result of error. Some endings occur because a role has been fulfilled. Endurance is often praised, but endurance without discernment becomes misalignment. There is a difference between faithfulness and prolonged exposure to distortion. When love continues beyond its purpose, it stops correcting what is wrong and begins concealing it. And when concealment replaces correction, removal becomes inevitable. God does not remove people impulsively. He removes them precisely when their continued presence no longer produces growth, but delay. You were not taken out because you weakened. You were taken out because staying any longer would have interfered with the next phase of accountability. To understand why this accountability required your absence, the role you were unknowingly playing must be made clear. You were a covering, not a destination. Most people misunderstand why certain relationships lasted as long as they did. They assume duration equals approval. They believe endurance means endorsement. That assumption is dangerous. You were not placed in that person's life to become their refuge from consequence. You were not assigned to absorb what they refused to face. Yet, over time, that is exactly what happened. Your presence softened the impact of their behavior. Your patience delayed the natural response their actions deserved. Your steadiness created an artificial sense of stability around someone who was internally unstable. In effect, you became a covering. A covering is not a reward. It is not a destination. It is a temporary shield designed to protect what still has the capacity to be corrected. The problem arises when a covering remains in place after correction has been rejected. When manipulation is met with tolerance instead of resistance. When distortion is met with explanation instead of consequence. When cruelty is met with compassion that asks nothing in return. At that point, the covering no longer protects growth, it prevents accountability. And this is where many people unknowingly cross a spiritual boundary. You were not keeping peace. You were postponing reckoning. The narcissist did not change because there was no urgency to change. Your presence absorbed the discomfort that would have forced self-examination. As long as you remained steady, they could remain unchanged. This is why your role was never meant to be permanent. A covering is designed to be lifted once its purpose has been fulfilled. If it is not lifted, it becomes a hiding place. And God does not allow hiding places to exist indefinitely. What felt like loyalty on your part slowly turned into obstruction, not because you intended harm, but because your endurance began to interfere with truth. There comes a moment when continued patience no longer demonstrates strength, it signals permission. Permission for patterns to deepen. Permission for distortion to normalize. Permission for harm to remain unchallenged. This is the moment many people miss. They believe staying longer proves love. They believe absorbing more damage proves faithfulness. They believe holding the relationship together proves moral superiority. But morality is not measured by how much injustice one can endure. It is measured by whether truth is allowed to function. You were never meant to be the destination where their behavior found rest. You were meant to be a passage, one that eventually closed. When that passage remained open too long, God intervened, not to punish you but to restore order. Your removal did not strip them of comfort arbitrarily. It removed a shield that had outlived its purpose. And once that shield was gone, something unavoidable began to happen. Because while a covering remains in place, the one beneath it can never fully feel the weight of what they create. The narcissist could not feel consequences while you were there. As long as you remained present, consequences were muted. Not erased, muted. Every time harm was done, you absorbed the shock. Every time reality attempted to correct behavior, you softened the impact. Every time accountability tried to arrive, it was delayed by your restraint. This is the part most people struggle to accept. The narcissist did not avoid consequence because they were clever. They avoided consequence because someone else was carrying it. You were not merely enduring discomfort. You were intercepting reality. Your emotional regulation compensated for their instability. Your moral clarity compensated for their distortion. Your willingness to reflect compensated for their refusal to self-examine. As a result, the environment remained artificially stable. And artificial stability is dangerous. It gives the appearance of peace while preventing transformation. It creates the illusion that behavior has no cost. It allows patterns to deepen without resistance. When consequences do not arrive on time, they do not disappear. They accumulate. The narcissist could not feel the weight of their actions because the weight never reached them. It stopped with you. That is why arguments never resolved anything. That is why apologies never produced change. That is why cycles repeated with greater intensity. Without consequence, insight has no urgency. Without urgency, reflection never happens. And without reflection, nothing corrects itself. This is not a failure of love. It is the limitation of shielding. Shielding can protect for a season, but shielding cannot reform what refuses accountability. Over time, your presence became a buffer between behavior and outcome. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but consistently. And consistency matters, because the longer consequences are delayed, the more severe they must become once they arrive. This is why removal becomes necessary, not to create pain, but to allow sensation. Not to cause harm, but to restore feedback. Not to punish, but to reconnect actions with outcomes. God does not need to intervene dramatically when structure already exists. He simply removes what has been interrupting it. When you were removed, something essential changed. Cause and effect were reunited. For the first time, behavior no longer disappeared into your endurance. For the first time, manipulation was not met with explanation. For the first time, distortion was not softened by compassion. And that is when feeling begins. Not emotional awareness, not remorse, but sensation. The kind that forces a person to confront the environment they have created. This is uncomfortable truth, but it is necessary truth. Many people confuse mercy with endless insulation. But mercy without consequence does not heal. It delays reckoning, and delay, extended beyond its purpose, becomes injustice. If you have ever wondered why nothing changed, no matter how much you gave, consider this carefully. What you were providing was relief, not correction. Relief soothes. Correction teaches, and teaching cannot occur where sensation is blocked. If you recognize that your presence was shielding someone from consequences, write in the comments, "I was the covering." 7. And when that covering was finally removed, Consequences were no longer delayed, they were allowed to speak. San, 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 San. God removed you so consequences could finally speak. There is a moment when restraint no longer serves its purpose. Not because restraint was wrong, but because its season has ended. God does not rush this moment. He allows patterns to reveal themselves fully. He permits time for self-correction. He gives space for recognition. But when recognition never comes, and correction is consistently avoided, restraint becomes interference. At that point, God does not escalate. He withdraws. Your removal was not an act of aggression. It was an act of alignment. Alignment between cause and effect. Alignment between behavior and outcome. Alignment between truth and experience. As long as you remained, consequences struggled to find their voice. They were softened by your explanations, delayed by your patience, muted by your presence. Once you were removed, consequence no longer needed permission. This is not dramatic justice. It is functional justice. God did not need to expose anyone publicly. He did not need to shame, confront, or humiliate. He simply allowed reality to resume its natural role. When the covering is lifted, behavior becomes audible. What had been hidden behind relational stability now stood on its own. What had been excused by compassion now faced its own weight. What had been diffused through your endurance now arrived undiluted. This is where many people misunderstand what is happening. They assume removal is abandonment. They assume silence is indifference. They assume distance means disengagement. In truth, distance is often the clearest form of engagement God uses. By stepping back, He allows truth to step forward. Consequences do not shout. They do not argue. They do not explain themselves. They simply arrive. And when they arrive without restraint, they teach what words never could. The narcissist does not suddenly gain insight because of confrontation. Insight comes when outcomes can no longer be avoided. This is why nothing changed while you stayed, and why everything began to shift once you left. Not because you were controlling the situation, but because your presence was regulating it. God removed you because regulation was no longer appropriate. Correction was required. This does not mean destruction is the goal. It means clarity is unavoidable. When restraint is removed, systems reveal their true condition. Stability proves whether it was genuine or borrowed. Peace reveals whether it was internal or dependent. And borrowed peace cannot survive separation. God does not remove the righteous to punish the unrighteous. He removes the righteous to restore order. Order is not cruel. Order is necessary. Without order, accountability collapses. Without accountability, distortion thrives. Your absence restored what your presence could not. And once consequence was permitted to speak, it did so with precision. No exaggeration, no emotion, just reality, uninterrupted. And when consequences are finally allowed to operate, the one who avoided them must begin living inside what they created. See. They begin to live inside what they once caused. When consequences are finally allowed to operate without interference, they do not arrive as a single event. They arrive as a condition. This is where many people misunderstand divine justice. They expect something loud, something sudden, something visible. But God rarely teaches through spectacle. He teaches through immersion. The narcissist does not suddenly realize everything. What happens instead is far more unsettling. The emotional environment they once exported becomes the atmosphere they must now breathe. What you carried quietly becomes their daily weight. What you absorbed privately becomes their constant pressure. What you endured in silence becomes the internal climate of their life. Confusion is no longer something they cause, it is something they inhabit. Instability is no longer something they provoke, it is something they manage. Isolation is no longer a tool they use, it becomes their condition. This is not punishment, this is placement. They are placed inside the reality they constructed, without mediation. While you were present, their inner disorder had an external regulator. You brought clarity where they produced confusion. You brought steadiness where they introduced volatility. You brought emotional continuity where they fractured connection. Once you were removed, the internal world had to sustain itself, and it could not. This is where the real weight begins, not because something new is added, but because nothing is being absorbed anymore. Sleep becomes inconsistent, not because of guilt, but because instability has no anchor. Relationships feel strained, not because of attack, but because cohesion requires self-regulation. Conversations feel tense, not because of opposition, but because harmony was never internalized. They begin to experience something unfamiliar, the inability to offload discomfort. When they feel agitated, no one calms the atmosphere. When they feel confused, no one organizes the narrative. When they feel exposed, no one smooths the edges. The environment no longer compensates for the inner disorder. This is the moment many people misinterpret. They look for regret. They look for repentance. They look for confession. But divine justice does not begin with repentance. It begins with awareness. And awareness does not come from explanation. It comes from sustained exposure. Living inside one's own patterns forces recognition, not always moral recognition, but experiential recognition. They begin to notice that wherever they go, the same tension follows, the same misunderstandings, the same breakdowns, the same relational fatigue. Not because others are the problem, but because the internal architecture has not changed. While you were there, your presence interrupted this pattern. Your patience reset the system. Your stability bought time. Without you, time no longer cushions impact. The narcissist now encounters resistance where they once exerted control. They encounter emotional pushback where they once imposed confusion. They encounter emptiness where they once extracted attention. And this is deeply unsettling, not because it hurts, but because it reveals. Revelation does not come as condemnation. It comes as repetition. The same outcomes, again and again. The same emotional dead ends. The same sense of friction without resolution. This is the weight you carried, not once, not dramatically, but consistently. And now, without your presence, the weight no longer moves outward. It stays. This is why your removal was necessary. As long as you were there, they were insulated from the cumulative effect of their actions. Once you were gone, accumulation began. God did not accelerate judgment. He removed interference. And when interference ends, alignment takes over. The narcissist now lives inside the emotional economy they created, where instability costs energy, where confusion produces isolation, where manipulation yields exhaustion instead of control. This is not vengeance. It is gravity, and gravity does not announce itself. It simply pulls consistently, relentlessly, without exception. And when living inside that reality becomes unbearable, the search for replacement begins revealing something even more decisive. Woo, 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 woo. What replaced you had no mercy. When the weight of living inside their own reality becomes unbearable, the narcissist does what they have always done. They search for relief, not transformation, not correction. Relief. They assume that replacing you will restore balance. They believe another presence can recreate the stability you once provided. They expect the environment to soften again. But this is where reality sharpens. What replaces you does not carry restraint. It does not regulate chaos. It does not absorb disorder. Because what replaced you was never sent to cover, it was allowed to expose. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of divine order. People assume that loss is followed immediately by restoration of the same kind. But God does not replace a covering with another covering when the season of covering has ended. He allows contrast. The new presence does not explain away manipulation. It does not soften volatility. It does not translate confusion into coherence. Instead, it reflects back what is given. Where you responded with patience, it responds with resistance. Where you brought stability, it brings unpredictability. Where you absorb tension, it returns it unchanged. This is not cruelty. It is alignment. The narcissist quickly discovers that the environment no longer adjusts to them. Instead, they must adjust to the environment, and they are not equipped to do so. What once felt manageable now feels hostile. What once felt controlled now feels unstable. What once felt familiar now feels disorienting. And this is deeply unsettling. Because the narcissist does not struggle most with loss, they struggle with loss of regulation. You regulated more than you realized. Your moral clarity shaped the tone of interactions. Your consistency anchored emotional exchanges. Your endurance kept systems functional that should have collapsed. Without that regulation, the system does collapse, but not dramatically. It collapses quietly. Communication becomes strained. Trust erodes quickly. Conflict escalates instead of resolving. The replacement does not know how to stabilize, because stabilization was never the assignment. This is where comparison begins. Not comparison rooted in affection, but in function. They begin to notice what is missing. Not love, but restraint. Not connection, but containment. They realize that what you provided was not common. It was not accidental. It was not easily replicated. And yet, this realization does not immediately lead to humility. It leads to discomfort, because acknowledging the value of restraint also means acknowledging the cost of abusing it. The narcissist now experiences what happens when mercy is no longer available on demand, when mistakes are met with consequence, when volatility is met with distance, when manipulation is met with refusal. This is not punishment imposed by others. It is a natural response to behavior unbuffered by compassion. The absence of mercy does not destroy them. It reveals them. It reveals how dependent they were on someone else's stability. It reveals how little internal structure was ever built. It reveals how much of their confidence relied on external regulation. While you were present, imbalance could exist without collapse. Once you were gone, imbalance produced immediate friction. This is why replacement fails. Not because you were irreplaceable as a person, but because the function you served was never meant to be permanent. You were a covering for a season. The season ended. What followed was not designed to comfort. It was designed to clarify. God does not send mercy indefinitely when mercy is repeatedly exploited. He allows reality to do what mercy once postponed. And reality is impartial. It does not soothe. It does not explain. It does not wait. It simply responds. The narcissist now encounters a world that responds to them exactly as they are, without filtration, without cushioning, without rescue. This is the moment many interpret as things getting worse. But in truth, this is things becoming accurate. Accurate environments do not flatter distortion. They expose it. And exposure is not the end. It is the threshold. But while their world grows sharper, something different begins to happen within you, because you are no longer positioned to cover what should now stand on its own. Leo, 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 Leo. Healing begins when you refuse to cover again. Healing does not begin when the narcissist collapses. That belief is one of the most damaging misconceptions people carry. Healing begins when you are no longer available to absorb what is not yours to carry. For a long time, your identity was quietly shaped by a role you never formally accepted. You became the stabilizer, the interpreter, the one who held tension so others could avoid it. This role did not announce itself. It formed gradually through responsibility, conscience, and restraint. And because it formed slowly, it was difficult to recognize when it needed to end. Many people believe healing comes from understanding the other person, from explaining their behavior, from tracing their wounds. But understanding without disengagement only recreates the same position of coverage. You do not heal by gaining insight into dysfunction. You heal by withdrawing the function that made dysfunction sustainable. As long as you continue to watch, interpret, explain, or anticipate the narcissist's experience, you remain psychologically positioned as a regulator. Attention is not neutral. It stabilizes what it focuses on. When you monitor their outcomes, you silently resume responsibility. When you track their decline, you keep yourself emotionally adjacent to the system. When you wonder whether they feel it now, you remain tied to the feedback loop. True separation is not physical distance. It is functional refusal. Refusal to translate chaos. Refusal to mediate consequences. Refusal to remain emotionally available for regulation. This is where many struggle, not because they lack strength, but because they confuse disengagement with cruelty. But disengagement is not cruelty. It is clarity. You are not called to ensure that consequences teach the right lesson. You are not assigned to manage the timing of awareness. You are not responsible for whether another person grows. Your responsibility ends where accountability must begin. Forgiveness, properly understood, is not re-entry. It is release without return. Forgiveness says, I no longer carry this. It does not say, I will stabilize you again. Healing requires boundaries that do not negotiate. A boundary is not an argument. It is not a justification. It is a position. And positions must be held consistently to be effective. Every time you are tempted to re-explain, re-engage, or re-monitor, understand what is at stake. You are being invited back into a role God already removed you from. Not because you were ineffective, but because the role itself had expired. Healing begins when you accept that your capacity to endure is not the same as your calling to remain. You were strong enough to stay, but staying would have required you to violate the truth that was forming. This is where maturity replaces endurance. Endurance tolerates. Maturity discerns. Endurance absorbs. Maturity releases. Endurance asks, how much more can I carry? Maturity asks, why am I still carrying this at all? The moment you stop covering again emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. Not because life becomes easy, but because life becomes accurate. You no longer brace for instability that is not yours. You no longer anticipate volatility that you no longer manage. You no longer regulate what you no longer participate in. This is where peace becomes possible, not the fragile peace of control, but the grounded peace of alignment. Alignment with truth. Alignment with limits. Alignment with responsibility. And alignment always heals, even when it feels unfamiliar at first. You are not healed when they suffer. You are healed when you are no longer positioned to prevent their suffering. That distinction matters. Because as long as you remain capable of stepping back into coverage, the cycle remains alive. Healing closes the cycle not by confrontation, but by refusal. Refusal to re-enter roles that distort responsibility. Refusal to carry what was never assigned to you permanently. Refusal to confuse compassion with containment. This refusal is not bitterness, it is obedience, and obedience always restores internal order before it produces external clarity. And once you are no longer positioned to cover again, the reason for your removal becomes unmistakably clear. T. God removed you because your next season requires boundaries. God did not remove you to punish anyone or to prove a point. He removed you to restore order. Some situations cannot be healed through endurance alone. Some patterns cannot be corrected while responsibility is being absorbed by the wrong person. Your removal returned weight to where it belongs. Justice, in its purest form, is not spectacle, it is alignment. Alignment between actions and consequences. Alignment between character and outcome. When God steps back, truth steps forward. Your next season does not require endless patience or sacrifice. It requires discernment, clarity, and boundaries. Boundaries are not rejection. They are wisdom in action. You were not removed because you lacked love. You were removed because love was no longer meant to cover what refused accountability. The season of endurance has ended. The season of wisdom has begun. And wisdom knows when to step aside so truth can stand on its own.